Is the question whether inequality creates barriers to mobility, which I think is the question that David asked. And probably everybody in this room, knows the recent work of Chetty et al. David Ruski's here somewhere. He's part of the et al. Of this paper that that showed that absolute mobility is inversely related to top income share. And the question is this relationship causal? A correlation doesn't meet causation. Rising top incomes as pay for performance might promote economic growth and not create barriers to mobility. But on the other hand, rising top incomes as rent capture, presumably would create a barrier to earnings growth for the bottom 90%. And there's a kind of a debate. This is an earlier version of this slide that should say defending the 1%, which is a paper that Greg Mankiw wrote. That in some sense was a critique of the price of inequality that Stiglitz wrote, and Mankiw's position was, if the 1% are being compensated according to market mechanisms, they're not creating inequality, they're creating growth, and Stiglitz says, they're rent capture a lot of it, and that's a problem. And so we're going to explore this issue in this paper via the study of executive compensation. CEOs make up a big chunk of the top 1% or top 1/10 of 1% or higher than that still, and their median compensation, continues to rise, it's now around 335 times the average worker in the United States. And so, the question is the allocation of this resource sufficient? Are shareholders benefiting from compensating their CEO so generously as everybody else benefiting? And some argue that they do, and that high compensation levels come from result of matching the best CEOs to the firms in which the marginal return of their labor is greatest. And there's a well-known paper in this literature by Gavet and Landier that was written in 2008, which was addressing the question of why is CEO pay rising? And their argument is, big firms are getting bigger, and the bigger firms get, the more valuable it is to hire the very best CEO of those firms, and this matching process creates rising compensation. And others argue that high compensation levels are the result of rent extraction, and that there's a governance problem in firms. And so, in this paper, we look at the process by which CEOs get paid to see if we can see bias and therefore evidence of rent extraction. And particularly, we're going to look at the peer benchmarking system. So the peer benchmarking is the process of selecting a compensation peer group, i.e. a set of comparable firms, to evaluate whether a CEO was paid at the market rate or not. And we're taking advantage of the fact that in 2006, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, started requiring firms to disclose the compensation peers that they use in the pay setting process. And while not every firm has complied with this directive, so more and more have, and it gives data, okay? And the rationale for this policy, was that, if markets aren't working properly, then, maybe it's a problem of information, so you pump information into the market, and that then makes it work more efficiently. And, specifically, if, firms are required to disclose the peer groups, and then shareholders and stakeholders can scrutinize the pay, and this could force firms to pay at the market rate, or if they don't, then shareholders can do something to try to correct that. And things like institutional shareholder services came into existence to provide advice to institutional investors. And one of the things they provide advice about is whether the peer group is appropriate for this firm. And so there's two sort of competing predictions that one can make. So one is that peer benchmarking increases transparency and forces CEO compensation to conform with the market. But there's an alternative and maybe partly competing prediction that it provides a pathway to make biased comparisons salient and sort of to legitimize pay that's above the market rate. So the question is, how easy is it to bias this benchmarking process? So the theoretical underpinning of prediction one is that if the correct peer group is selected, then disclosure allows for an accurate evaluation of CEO pay. I mean, that's how, everybody sort of is paid, academics and clerical workers and janitors and all kinds of people are, paid in large part by the people responsible for paying them, going and benchmarking and figuring out how much money should be paid people like this in this particular market that we're in. And the theoretical underpinning of prediction two, stems from the fact that selecting an appropriate peer group isn't so straightforward. And evaluating whether the peer group's appropriate isn't straightforward. And, for example, Zuckerman's concept of structural incoherence. If there's some parts of the sort of firm space where it's sort of clear who the right peers are, and there's lots of other parts of firm space where it isn't so clear, and that provides the basis for discussion. And that lack of clarity provides opportunity for introduction of bias, which is what we're going to look for. The CEO obviously has an incentive to have an overly biased peer group because it makes him or her, mostly him, look underpaid, and the process legitimizes higher pay. One might argue, well, the compensation committee should correct that, but there are certain pressures on the compensation committee that would favor bias. If the director's compensation committee comes from the directors hired the CEO, they're pressuring them to maintain the image if they hired a CEO who's better than average. They may have social ties to the CEO, and many of them may in fact be CEOs as well, and they have an interest in CEOs getting paid well, because then that CEO may be in their benchmark, in which case that they can argue for higher pay. So the question of what would upward bias look like, well, it's a situation in which firms are selecting peer firms that are slightly larger and have especially well-paid CEOs, and that's what what we're going to look for. And the consequences that are sort of straightforward. That CEOs who have biased compensation groups will directly benefit from that, and other CEOs who have those CEOs in their peer group will indirectly benefit from that, and that can lead to a ratcheting effect, which I and my co-authors talked about in a paper that was published a few years ago about the ability of this kind of ratcheting process. In other words, governance is not really a firm level phenomenon, it's a market phenomenon. It doesn't take that many sort of bad apple firms to infect all the peer groups of all the other firms, and therefore have indirect effects on compensation. Now there's been a lot of research on compensation peer groups in recent years, and it doesn't all say the same thing. So Falconer and Yang wrote some papers saying, yes, the average firm upwardly biases its peer group and it affects pay. There's a paper by Albuquerque et al. Who argued that, what appears to be bias isn't really bias, it's just a reward for talent. And then there are others like Hadman and Carter who argue that Falconer and Yang use the wrong peer groups, if you use the right peer groups, then you discover there's no bias. So there's some controversy in this literature. I think that our paper actually resolves a lot of this. Now, and so I'll go on a little bit, but just try to stay within my time. So Falconer and Yang's strategy was to construct counterfactual peer groups by using tie formation and a propensity score matching framework. And then they looked at the relationship, regressed peer group bias and CEO compensation. They found that peer groups are upwardly biased, and they found that upward bias in compensation peer groups is associated with higher compensation. And the work can be criticized because they were using propensity score matching to try to find natural peers from the named peers. And of course, if the named peers are biased, then the characteristics of them will have an impact on the counterfactual peers. Now, what Albuquerque did is that they predicted peer group bias with, they used actually Falconer and Yang's method and then another method, and they tried to estimate, and they did estimate peer group bias. Then their question was, is this correlated with talent? And they created a set of talent measures, a set of self-serving measures having to do with the governance of the firm, And what they found was that the predictive power of the talent measures is higher than the predictive power of the self-serving measures, which led them to conclude that, in fact, what appears to be bias is actually a reward for talent. I mean, this raises some questions. It's, why would CEOs care about a biased peer group as a reward for talent, as opposed to why not just sort of, benchmarking them sort of overtly in the right tail of their natural peer group? I guess more penetratingly, if you look at their analysis, you see that their talent measures account for only about 5% of the variation in the peer group bias, and that 95% that's unexplained by their talent measures has a strong relationship to pay. Right? So, and then when we go on that, what does talent mean? How do you measure it? You can come up with 3 or 4 different ways, and you discover they correlate very poorly. And then Cadman and Carter, who were critical of Falkender-Yang, they defined counterfactual peers as the union of a focal firm's actual peers, the firms listed as peers of the focal firm's peers, i.e. the peers of the peers, and any firms in the full sample of firms that list the focal firm as a peer. And the result of their study is that peer group bias is smaller than in previous studies, and its predictive power of peer group bias and compensation is lower, but they still found bias and they still found a relationship. And one of the issues with their study is that they use in their counterfactual peer group is the named peer group. So if the named peer group is biased, their counterfactual peer group is going to be biased as well. So what we did is we took data from the F-14 forms that the CEOs at the corporations, public corporations, they will submit every year. We took financial data from CompuStat. We took total compensation and board membership data from Morningstar. We took institutional ownership data from Thomson Reuters. We took data on the bank analysts from IBES. This is an example of a list of peer groups in a particular Def 14 of some firm. So basically use a computer algorithm to scrape all this stuff. And we generated the largest data set on named peers over more years than any of the other studies. And so there's a lot of data. And our strategy is to determine whether there is bias. And we're looking to predict bias of 2 main factors: firm performance and something we're going to call structural ambiguity. And we're going to then examine the question of whether bias and variance and bias has changed over time, because the whole point of this 2006 requirement was to make things more transparent. So the question is, do we see evidence that the transparency is reducing bias? So we measured the peer pay gap, the PPG, as the ratio of the median pay of the named and the counterfactual peer groups. How to construct a natural peer group. So we did something, which I think was a bit innovative and very sensible, which is that we observed the fact that if there was no bias in peer groups, then firms would be looking for other firms like them, and those other firms would be looking for firms like them too, which means there'd be a certain amount of reciprocity. And so reciprocal ties are almost, in the population can't be biased. And so we looked to see, what was it that was determining the selection of a reciprocal tie, and we used, characteristics of similarity, similar revenues, similar market cap, similar industry, similar assets, similar number of employees, the extent to which the firms tend to get covered by the same analysts in the IDES data, similar industry. And we use this to create a prediction model, and then we use that prediction model to basically sample counterfactual peers. And we did it in a way to sort of force it not to be biased by basically getting N over 2 of the peers from firms that are smaller and N over 2 of the firms peers from firms that are larger, where N is the number of peers that that firm typically chooses, and those numbers are around 20. And we do this over and over and over again, okay? In order, and then we look at the median of this. And so this right here is actually the distribution of named peers. It's the ratio of the name to the focal peer, and you can see the bias because it's sticking that way. Falkender and Yang's measures over here, and our measure is really tightly tracking the non-bias measure. And you can see here the sort of implications. So this is, this is the observed percentile in the named peer group where CEOs in our large data set are sitting, and you can see that, in general, they're paid below the 50% line, which means they're underpaid, which means you have to raise their pay. But in the counterfactual peer groups, they're generally paid over the 50%. And so that difference, in some sense, is an indication of what's going on. We defined these two concepts, structural ambiguity and peer group constraint, okay? Structural ambiguity is the variation in the median pay across hundreds of simulations. So again, firms differ in where they sort of sit. Like if you're Delta Airlines, like who are your peers? Well, I mean, it's sort of obvious United Airlines is a peer, it's obvious American Airlines is a peer. So some firms have sort of tight natural peer groups, and other firms don't. And we measured this by the extent of variation in the peer pay gap we got over these hundreds of simulations. And then we also measured something we call peer group constraint, which is the extent to which I'll say 20, but the number of peers that are typically used is around 20. The 20 firms with the highest probability of being selected actually have high probabilities. When they have very high probabilities, there's a strong constraint. Both of these measures are basically saying to the compensation committee, it's obvious who your peers are. And so you choose them. And when it's not so obvious, and so this here is a graph of the quintiles of this distribution of structural ambiguity. And what you can see here, this is just a descriptive graph, but you can see this peer pay gap, that is the bias, gets bigger as the structural ambiguity gets larger, which is evidence of the discretion that exists being used. This is a model of lots of numbers. You can't sort of see them out there, but we're estimating the peer pay gap as a function of characteristics of the firm. And also benchmarking discretion and peer group constraint. And what you see over here is that benchmarking discretion and peer group constraint are working as you would expect. That is, the more benchmarking discretion there is, the higher is the bias. And the weaker is this peer group constraint, the higher is the bias. And this is true if you use firm fixed effects or not. And so one thing I didn't say, but firms change their peer groups all the time. About 60% of the years have different peer groups to some extent from the previous year. So, but it's also the case that bias isn't limited to firms that have structural ambiguity that perform, and also what I guess I didn't show is that firms that perform more poorly tend to have more bias, which also makes sense, because if the firm is performing very well, you don't have to, you can be transparent about the CEO, deserving pay. It's the firms that are performing less poorly, and indeed in years where they're performing less poorly, that you tend to see the bias being larger. But bias isn't limited to those firms. So we found that being one standard deviation less structurally ambiguous and performing at the 75th percentile, it reduces predicted bias. This ratio, so to speak, of the name to the counterfactual peer, the median over all those simulations, from 1.3 to 1.15. So there's still general bias. And so then the question is, does this predict compensation? And the answer is that it does. So you can't, again, you can't see these numbers, but I'm just giving you a feel that these models exist. The counterfactual peer pay has a big effect on compensation, but also the peer pay gap has a big effect on compensation, and these effects persist even when you control for all these characteristics of the firm, and even when you put fixed effects in, that these things are driving pay, and you can see that here. So this is the graph of the yearly trends of observed CEO compensation, which is here. And this is the pay that these same CEOs would have if they were paid at the 50th percentile of their counterfactual peer group. And this line here is if they're paid at the same percentile that they are paid of the named peer group in the counterfactual peer group. And this is 5 million, and this is like 3.5 million. So this is money, okay? And then finally, the last thing is the question of trends. Did the bias and variance in bias change over time? And did the association between bias and pay change? So these are like 4 different graphs that are sort of showing, so this is, and the solid line is all the firms, and the dotted line is the firms that we have 11 years of data for. And what this is showing is that the median peer pay gap has been falling over time from 2006 to 2008. And this is showing that the median percent that are reciprocated has been rising. So there is some evidence that, when the environment, gets like more controlling, that even big corporations respond to it. And this is the interquartile range of the peer pay gap, so that's been dropping as well. But the interesting thing about this is that if you were to go back and do the models that I showed you before, the effect of the peer pay gap, that is, the effect of the bias, has been rising even as the bias itself has been falling. So the effect has been offsetting the fall in bias. And so in other words, the firms are being more transparent in terms of the peers they're choosing, but they're still making use of this bias more effectively than they did before. So those are the takeaways, that firms report compensation groups that are upwardly biased. Upward bias is associated with structural ambiguity and poor performance. Compensation is strongly associated with upward bias, and norms are starting to emerge, but the returns to bias have increased, which is offsetting the impact of the norms.
Oh, should I? Yeah, okay, I'm sorry.
Yeah, sure, okay. I'm here.
Thank you so much. I have a quick question, and it might be... I can just talk loud. If I'm understanding correctly, it looks like in your study and in the other studies that you were looking at, you were comparing CEOs to one another. Is that correct, in terms of compensation?
Well, I mean, in some sense, yeah, yes.
So my question...
We're comparing CEOs' pay to the pay of their compensation peer group, and then we're looking at that relationship across firms.
Okay, I think I'm understanding correctly. So I guess I'm wondering, with that data, how does that address the problem of pay gap between CEOs and their workers?
Well, it addresses it in the sense that, so what this paper isn't showing is the ratcheting effect that comes from this pay. But, I mean, in the first instance, if CEOs were paid based on a reasonable, counterfactual, normative peer group, there are norms. I mean, if you get compensation consultant handbooks, these things exist, and they tell you how to construct the peer groups, and that's what Institutional Shareholder Services is using. That would reduce the ratio between the CEO pay and the average worker. And if this kind of thing had been going on over the last 20 years, this ratcheting effect wouldn't have been going on over that time. And that would have had, actually a pretty large effect on what they're being paid.
Yep, there's one back.
So that was a lot.
Yes.
Just trying to follow you closely. So what accounts for, so there's the market correction, you fire someone when they don't perform well. But we see repeatedly companies that don't perform well, they retain their CEOs, and then next thing, you follow the fine print, and they just got an increase.
Well, what we show is that you end up having more bias in their peer group, which makes it look as if they're paid worse. And in other words, since they are in some sense being punished for their poor performance, but they aren't being punished. It's the peer group has more bias, and indeed maybe they're being punished too much. They deserve a raise.
We heard a little bit earlier today about some ideas surrounding historical progressive tax policies, and if there were a shift towards not all the way back to the 1970s with 70% top marginal tax rates, but if it were more towards that end, do you think that that would affect CEO compensation in a meaningful way from what you've seen in your studies?
Well, we know historically, if you go back to the 50s, where the top marginal rate was like 92%, you know, that back in those days, CEOs were well paid, but they're not well paid the way they were paid now. I saw this interesting historical article that said back then CEOs had big boats, you know, big speedboats, but of course now they have yachts, you know, because I mean, they were well paid relative to others, but nowhere near as well paid as they are now. And maybe that was partly because if your marginal tax rate is super high, you know, then there's not as much of a value to having that enormous pay.
All the way around the other side of the corner.
Another tax related question. What if there was a limit on how much of highly paid executives' compensation could be deducted from taxes? Do you think that would encourage companies to be more creative in terms of compensation, and it might lift the compensation for other workers?
Well, so I'm not a tax expert.
Well, it's
No, I mean, I would think there are ways to get executive compensation under control.
I mean, for example,
Firms are very creative. You know, on the other hand, the more they actually have to pay, and the more transparent the process is.
I mean, like 401k plans, I believe, have, in order for them to, I think there are rules in terms of, in order for them to be in existence, there has to be kind of like a limit in terms of like how much the I think they call it highly compensated executives can participate in their plan. It's a way of forcing the plan to be more equitable, you know, throughout the organization. So,
No, sure.
the reason I asked that question because it's not a matter of saying you can't pay people for, you know, you can't limit the amount that you can pay, but you can limit how much you can tax deduct. Just like they did with, like, say, travel and entertainment. They said, okay, well, it was getting out of control, so they said, okay, well, certain travel and entertainment can't be deducted. And then there was kind of like a self-regulating. So you're not going to be a tax expert, it's just a matter of.
Well, I mean, we all remember Mitt Romney, and you know, when it was discovered or revealed during the campaign that Mitt Romney had an IRA that was worth $100 million, even though, you know, the annual limit on contributions to IRAs are around $50,000. And the question is, how did he get $100 million in it? And the answer was because he didn't put money into it, he put radically undervalued assets into it. And then these radically undervalued assets then all of a sudden were correctly valued, and all of a sudden it's not like he put in $50,000 that year, he put in, I don't know, $2 million or $800,000 or whatever it was. So that's something that could be controlled, of course. And that's, you know, tax deduction, he's not paying taxes.